Are you a leader, manager, entrepreneur, business owner, or knowledge worker? Are you leading people or wondering how to be a better leader in your own life and work? If you are, then you can be experimenting better. Welcome to The Experimental Leader, a podcast that takes a look at the ways leaders are experimenting in their own work. Hosted by Melanie Parrish, we dive into real-life conversations about how people might be using a scientist's mindset and experimenting in their work. Shift your leadership into something that works better. Join us on The Experimental Leader today.
Hello, it's great to be here with you live today on the Experimental Leader podcast. I'm Melanie Parrish, and I am just loving being here with you today. I've also been thinking a little bit about my own inner landscape, and I've been thinking about how sometimes I'm not very resilient when plans change. Happy Tuesday, Ruth. I see you. Ruth was asking if leaders are born or made, and I think she said both, which I agree with. But so I've been thinking about how I'm not good at plans changing, and sometimes I have like almost an emotional reaction when plans change at the last minute. And I noticed that it can be hard on relationships that I have this reaction. And then if I have a minute and I think about it for a minute, I get to sort of my more intentional self and I get to an intentional response. But in that moment, I can actually sound annoyed with the change of plans. And I notice I'm traveling a ton right now. And I feel like when I invest in plans, I get like sunk costs. I feel like I've got sunk costs because I've been investing and making these plans. And then when they change at the last minute because of someone else, I get frustrated, and it's not useful in my relationships. And it's like when I get back to that place that I am intentional about it, I'm not even annoyed anymore, but I may have expressed annoyance to someone and that has an impact. So I've been really thinking about this, and I'm wondering if there's things that you find that your emotional response doesn't match like what your long-term thinking is about something. Like I'm totally happy for people to control their own destiny and make plans and shift on the fly. And then there's something that happens when plans change at the last minute, and I'm not very good at it. So I just really challenge you to think about the places where you're not in alignment with yourself this week. I think it's an interesting place. Also, I am super excited to be here today with Liam Martin. He's here from Running Remote, and it's the largest conference on building and scaling remote teams. I'm so excited to talk about remote teams with him. He's been working remotely for almost 20 years with team members in 43 different countries. And he's going to talk to us today about how almost everyone who started working remotely during the pandemic have done it wrong. So welcome to the show, Liam. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and discuss how almost everyone got it wrong, which is a bit of a hyperbolic statement, to be completely honest with you. There are plenty of people that have done fantastically well with remote work, but I think that everyone probably needs a little bit of an introduction to remote work, which they never really had back in March of 2020.
So you've been working remotely for a long time. I have too. I mean, I've been working remotely for 23 years as a coach, and you've been working 20 years. So it was interesting that everyone joined us this last couple of years. How did they get it wrong?
Well, I think it wasn't their fault. But when I think about remote work, everyone moved from working in an office to working from home. And I love that the media is using this terminology, work from home, because both of those things are not remote work. working from an office is a place and working from home is a place. Remote work is allowing your employees and your workforce en masse to be able to work wherever they want, whenever they want. So whether that's from home, from an office, from a coffee shop, from a co-working space, in another country, it enables people to be able to have the autonomy to be able to, as my friend Cal Newport wrote in his seminal book on the subject, Deep Work, the ability to engage in deep work and solve large, difficult problems faster than anyone else. If your organization can do that, then you will inevitably end up being more successful than anyone else inside of your organization or any of your competitors. And this is something that I think was effectively lost when we all transitioned to remote. January of 2020, 4% of the US workforce was working remotely. By March of 2020, 45% of the US workforce was working remotely. And more importantly, 75% of people that made more than $100,000 per year were working remotely as well. So all of these high-end workers ended up moving over to a completely different way of working, but no one really told them how to do it. I lovingly call those guys pandemic panickers because they effectively just panicked their way from the office to working from home, and no one ever gave them the ability to truly start working remotely.
I think that's really interesting. I think I've worked remotely, and I have found recently that I really like being in a place where I control the internet and things like that, especially as I do more Zoom. I get constrained not by anybody other than my own needs while I'm working.
Well, here's a perfect example. Here's my beautiful wife coming in with a sandwich right behind me, right? This is, thank you very much, Maddie. This is working from home for me, but it's also remote work. So she can come in and leave, and it really just is up to us to be able to figure out how we want to be able to work. It's effectively autonomy. That's really boils down to, and almost every business leadership book today will state that autonomy is actually the biggest variable that increases employee engagement and generally retention inside of an organization. Remote work is probably the motherlode of autonomy. But the vast majority of people right now are stuck on 8-hour Zoom calls. And that's not actually remote work. I don't know if probably a lot of your listeners or the people that are watching us right now wouldn't necessarily know this, but the vast majority of remote companies don't actually interact through Zoom or face-to-face. The vast majority of the time, we do something that I have talked about at length, which is asynchronous management, the ability to be able to build a company without actually interacting with people face-to-face.
And Deborah, I've worked so many places during the pandemic, and it was the most important thing that preserved my mental health. Thanks for that, Deborah. I think that's lovely. So we haven't freed people. We've still been putting them. I am a huge fan of the 15-minute meeting to avoid the 8 hours of Zoom calls, because I think it will take a toll on people. I think it's something that we don't even know the implications of yet. But what should people be thinking about, like right now, 2022? What should we be thinking about as leaders around, remote work?
Yeah. So what assumptions are you making from your conclusions is probably the biggest lesson that everyone can learn about remote work. The vast majority of workers simply recreated the office. So this is not the way that remote workers work. They require a different managerial framework, a different managerial philosophy. And being on Zoom, as an example, more than 8 hours, a day is not the way to be able to do that. I think the person that ended up connecting us was Vaishali. And Vaishali has worked for me for 8 years. The last time that I spoke to Vaishali, and we work on a daily basis together, the last time that we spoke was 2 years ago on a Zoom call. So we interact every single day, but we interact asynchronously. We are able to work on what we're really good at, which is me getting on these podcasts and her booking those podcasts. And we both have autonomy in terms of how we actually execute on that, with an overarching amount of processes and systems in place to be able to make sure that if we do have any problems, we're both redundant to the process.
Interesting. And what's your take on things like ED&I and remote work, and where people might face more marginalization or less marginalization because of remote work?
So I think when you look at hybrid, which is the most popular option that's currently popping up right now, about 60% of the industry is moving towards hybrid work, as opposed to office is around 10 to 15%, and about 25% are pure remote work. The hybrid is actually the worst out of the three options. I'd rather have people go back to the office than remain hybrid. The reason is because of what we've been talking about for decades in the remote work world, which is the concept of distance bias. So unfortunately, the closer you are to a decision maker or a manager, the more your ideas get adopted by that decision maker or manager. So if you go to the office, you end up actually becoming more successful inside of that environment, counterintuitively. And then the remote workers are seen as second-class citizens inside of that organization. And they actually end up becoming frustrated, and they either leave that company or they go back to the office, which they didn't want to do in the first place. Being mindful of distance bias is absolutely critical. And this also applies to general remote kind of structuring when you think about the way that you should be solving for ideas. So I talk about how remote asynchronous teams really produce the rise of the introverted leader. I'm on the introverted side of the spectrum. It was very difficult for me to be able to speak on my feet effectively. And I don't know if this has happened to you, but generally the 6'2" white male that looks like Captain America is usually the person that ends up having the most ideas adopted in a meeting. It's just an inevitability. If you actually didn't tell me what their ideas were beforehand, and I was just able to look at them, I'd be like, you know what? I think this guy's going to have his idea adopted more than everyone else. And that's unfortunately just a bias that we all hold. Remote work, thankfully, and more specifically, asynchronous remote work, meaning they're not on a Zoom call, so that bias isn't there, allows for those introverted individuals that may actually have much better ideas than the extroverted people to have their ideas adopted more often. And if more ideas are adopted that are correct more often, then you end up with a much more competitive organization.
Yeah, I think that data is really interesting. And by the way, for those of you who haven't looked at this data, like go find some and look at it. 6'3" is the point where men's income, if you're taller than 6'3", then your income starts to go down. So that matches really closely to what you've just said. It's like literally a scale. Like it goes up until you get to 6'2", and then at 6'3", and then it starts to go down again because at 6'5".
I didn't even know that. That's an interesting one because I just kind of pulled that one right out of the air. The 6'2" Captain America white male is probably the, if I looked at that person, I would say, man, that person's probably going to have their ideas adopted, everything remaining equal, more than anyone else.
Well, and it's interesting if you think about the ideas. I hadn't actually had this thought before. If your ideas are adopted, then when it comes to raise time, then you think, wow, they came up with really good ideas this year. So your bias actually supports them getting a bigger raise and takes it, to the financial. So those are supportive of each other, but I think it's super. I have one kid who's 6'1" and one who's 6'5", and so we sort of joke about who's going to make the most money at our house. Yeah, Deborah says again, great ideas coming up here. Thanks to both of you. I agree with what you're saying about hybrid work, and would add that those who have to stay at home are at a disadvantage This has been a gender issue during the pandemic. Yeah, I'd love to hear some of your nightmare stories about, things that went really wrong and things that went really well as people went to working to, I think that you said it wasn't actual remote work, but at least went online during COVID. What can you share with us?
Boy, so I had the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, I was being called by companies that I would have never interacted with pre-pandemic. I got called by a G20 country saying, hey, we need to take our entire country remote. It's like 570,000 government workers. And I said, well, I have about 150 people, so I have no idea how to do that. And the guy that, he answered very quickly, well, you're the first one we found that's picked up the phone. So there was such a small group of people that were doing remote work pre-pandemic that it was very difficult to be able to disseminate that information out to everyone else. I kind of felt like I had a life preserver. I had the answers to all of these questions, and there were just thousands of people in the water, and I had to be really choosy about where I put my time. And so I think that that's a big factor that we all need to take in consideration. But generally, I mean, we've seen working from home being, man, there's this scary virus outside that may or may not kill me. I'm under massive amounts of stress. I'm in a completely new working environment where I don't really understand the new rules of engagement effectively. How do I interact with my manager? How much synchronous time versus asynchronous time should I be implementing? So there were tons of issues, even inside of our own organization. I remember this one team member that almost had was having a nervous breakdown because someone had died in their condo complex in New York the very first couple days to weeks of the pandemic. And this individual was terrified to be able to leave their apartment. So we ended up actually getting like Uber Eats groceries deliveries sent to him and this kind of stuff to be able to just reduce his anxiety. But it was a very scary time, those first couple of weeks of the pandemic, and no one really knew what was going to happen. Thankfully, we got through it. Knock on wood that there isn't going to be Omicron Prime or something like that that's going to come after us in the next couple of weeks. But I think we're in a much better place now. And now we can kind of take a pause and hopefully get to remote work because I think everyone's had a taste of working from home, which the data shows employees definitely prefer in comparison to an office environment. They like the autonomy and freedom to be able to work wherever they want, whenever they want. But they need a lot more training, primarily on the employer side, to be able to make that really successful for both the employer and employee.
Yeah, I'm like super curious. So I'm just going to like play devil's advocate and just ask you some sort of like, yeah, but what about this and what about that? But
sure.
The first one that comes to mind is it, do people need some, I know that you have a person that does bookings for you that you haven't seen in 2 years, but what do we need to be thinking about emotional connection and seeing each other at work? Like, do we need to be fostering times that we do come together and have a conversation?
Yes, we do. So in remote teams, you usually meet once per year. So that's a team retreat where everyone comes together. It's like a conference about the company. And you do that for about 4 or 5 days. And then in some cases, departments would meet quarterly. So having that in-person time is really important, but that has almost nothing to do with the actual mechanics of the business. That's just being able to build rapport and trust with those team members.
Yeah.
However, when you actually look at the general environment that people work in, you don't need that much synchronous time in order to be able to build those components of trust. I talk a lot about how, at least in North America and Europe, arranged marriage is a bit of a taboo, but we have arranged friendships all the time. We're simply put into an office space with some people that we don't necessarily know. And we're like, oh, well, these should be our friends, right? Should be our social space. When in reality, remote workers actually do the opposite. the vast majority of the time, they actually have to strive out on their own and build social connections outside of their work lives. And it actually makes them much stronger people. The negative part of that for the employer is remote employees can join and leave companies faster than an office environment because those ties don't necessarily hold them back. But I would argue that the vast majority of people that are saying, I hate this company and this company is horrible, but I'm not going to quit because I love hanging out with Liam every Friday, is not a recipe for success inside of any organization.
I would agree with you there. I mean, my mind's twisting a little bit as I think about you're actually, knocking out some of the assumptions I have, which I think is really interesting. And it's fun to think about. So you're essentially saying that, if you're doing asynchronous remote work, you're not getting your needs met from, like, your emotional needs met from your coworkers. You're taking care of that elsewhere.
Absolutely. Post university and college, adult social circles degrade up until about their 60s. And then they start to expand again, right? And why do they expand? Because they've retired and they're forced into the process of actually going out and socializing.
I have a friend.
Why don't we go ahead?
Oh, I have a friend who just started going to the pool, and she's 55. So she's going to senior swim. And she's like, oh my gosh, everybody there wants to be my friend. They want to socialize. They want to do stuff. She's like, nobody ever just meets me and wants to do stuff. But it's this, like, totally what you're talking about. It's a different demographic.
Well, so why not do it at 30? Why not do it at 25? There's nothing holding you back. I have a very active social life that has nothing to do with my work life whatsoever. And then it creates an environment where I can say, I don't really like my job. And there are people that are fun in this particular position. I definitely have friends that are work friends, but I'm not putting all my eggs in that particular basket. Again, this is more for employees' happiness than the employer happiness, because sometimes the employer actually wants to retain that person for an extended amount of time. But it's making sure that those social ties do not necessarily define your decisions, which is important. And then I think also just being mindful that the entire concept around socializing is really a broken concept, I think, as it applies to the office environment. In the book that I've been writing over the last couple of years, I got the first recorded documentation of the office. I think it's 1825. And when the first ever recorded office environment was documented, and it was 3 of the most horrible pages I've ever written or read in my entire life. It was just like this hot, steamy, combative environment where people are on top of each other and there's no respite and people are stuck inside of these dark halls all day long. And unfortunately, that hasn't changed for the last 200 years.
Okay, I have another question.
Sure.
What about the leader who says, how will I know if my people are working if they're just doing it on their own time? How will I know, whether or not there's I'm going to put some words in here that they might not say, but how do I know if it's a fair value exchange?
Mm-hmm. So another thing that asynchronous companies do that I identified was, on average, their managerial layer was about 50% thinner than in office environments. So there are more workers doing work than there are workers that are managing people doing work, which is really good for the organization. Yeah. And that's an important factor to take into consideration. So there are more people actually producing a return than in office environments. Yeah. But also, everyone has very quantifiable goals. And the vast majority of those quantifiable goals are actually automated. So how many leads am I getting to the website might be the goal for me. Well, I can very quickly create some automations and can have that documentation put up on a scorecard relatively easily, because we have technologies that can enable us to be able to do that. Inside of office environments, and this is my perception based off my research, because I've never worked in an office before, but it is, well, I tell you what I did, you tell your manager what I did, and then that manager tells the boss what I did. In asynchronous remote teams, everyone has the same informational advantage as the CEO, or at least that's the goal. So when someone joins the company, they have access to our P&L, they know who our customers are, they know everyone's quantifiable metrics, they know whether they're on them or not hitting them. That doesn't necessarily need to be a discussion, and that ROI is very instantaneous. We also are very, very focused on documentation and instrumentation inside of remote teams. So I measure, as an example, how long I'm working on a particular task, and that information is communicated to everyone inside of the organization. I'm currently on podcast, the experimental leader task inside of a tool that I use called Time Doctor, and it's under the project management of podcast outreach. And I can, at the end of the month, identify how much time I spent on that, what were the returns, how many backlinks I generated, how much traffic did I generate from that particular activity. And then that information can be communicated to the CEO of the company. Very simple, very easy, and very there's no debate involved in that. That's not a soft goal. That's a hard goal.
And how does that fit with your goal of autonomy? Like when I hear that, I think, oh my gosh, I would not want that kind of tracking. And because it's like my fear of a conversation with my husband who would say, why did you spend $27 at the grocery store today? Which doesn't actually happen in my life, but I would never, ever want it to. So that's the closest thing I think of is like, oh, is somebody going to call me out on the way I micromanaged my time with that tool?
So at least inside of remote teams, there's a counterintuitive perspective. That is, the more bureaucracy that you have inside of an organization, the more efficient it becomes. I love the quote from Jocko Willink, which is discipline equals freedom. The ability to be able to have that documentation in place creates an environment where you might want to ask yourself, well, why do I not want to be open with that information? What is the issue connected to that? Is it that I don't necessarily want to be second guessed? Is it maybe because I'm concerned about my own performance, or I'm able to defend everything that I've done? And also inside of remote teams, if you're creating an environment of autonomy and trust, then everyone should be able, there shouldn't necessarily be an attack or a defense on anyone, but it's simply an issue of, well, how much time is it taking you to do podcasts, Liam? Oh, well, the average podcast from beginning to end actually takes me 2 hours and 17 minutes, as an example. I've done 537 up until this point. That's prep, outreach, the entire piece of that. And then Vaishali actually on the other end has another 45 minutes attached to her. So we can quantify the exact dollars and cents to a podcast, and then we can apply that towards the output and effectively boil it down to return on ad spend, which is really not truly what it is. But fundamentally, if you just reduce everything to those core metrics, it allows for you to, again, be very easy with understanding, is this working? And do we need to make a course correction as quickly as possible?
And I know that you do a conference, and I want to hear more about that.
Sure. So conference is runningremote.com. And it's the largest conference on remote work. We're doing the next one May 17th and 18th in Montreal, Canada. And it is solely focused on building billion-dollar remote-first companies. So if you're an employee, that's not the conference for you. If you're a digital nomad, that's not the conference for you. But if you're interested in building and scaling large-scale remote-first organizations, this is where you're going to learn all the tactics and strategies to be able to implement that. That's
amazing. Well, and where can people, is there any other place you want people to find you?
I think outside of runningremote.com, if you're interested in learning more about the conference or anything that we do, best spot would be YouTube, youtube.com/runningremote. We put all of our talks up there for free. And I also do some musings about remote work there as well. So either of those spots are perfect.
That's great. And thank you so much for being here. I've really enjoyed our conversation, Liam. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great. It was really lovely to speak to Liam. And I love this idea of in the experimental context, like we tried some experimenting on just taking remote work home or taking the office home. But what do we need to think about actually doing some continuous improvement, asking some really key questions about what do we want to do? And I'm fascinated by this idea of asynchronous remote work helping to build a more diverse and inclusive work environment and to get rid of some of the biases that we might have. I am fascinated by this idea. I want to continue to explore it. And I want to challenge you to look at what are your assumptions around remote workers, around people who work, in the office next to you. Pay attention to who you like more, who you feel more connected to, and why, and how much of it is proximity bias. I think it's a really interesting question. I hope that you have a great week. Go experiment.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Experimental Leader. We hope you have found value in today's episode because we're dedicated to helping you become the experimental leader you want to be. To access the show notes or learn more about working with Melanie, visit melanieparish.com. Go experiment.